December 12, 1942. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's opulent headquarters at Cattenhall. Before his senior Luftwaffe officers, men whose faces were etched with the confidence of victories in Poland, France, Britain, and the vast plains of Russia, the commander of the German Air Force gestured dismissively at a reconnaissance photograph on the table. It showed a tight, almost perfect formation of massive American bombers, their silver wings glinting in the stratosphere high above occupied France. They call it the Fliegende Festung, the Flying Fortress, an arrogant name for a slow, clumsy machine. Our pilots have a better name, the Fette Henne, the Fat Hen. A ripple of confident laughter born from 3 years of air superiority echoed through the grand hall. This was not baseless bravado. The logic behind the scorn was, from their perspective, unassailable. The combat-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe understood the brutal physics of aerial warfare better than anyone on Earth. Their doctrine, a masterpiece of tactical aggression, held one truth to be absolute: the unescorted daylight bomber was an act of suicide. It was a lumbering giant in a sky ruled by swift, deadly predators. Their Messerschmitt Bf-119s could climb like rockets to attack from above, while the Focke-Wulf 192, a superbly balanced fighter, could dive at incredible speeds, deliver a devastating punch with its powerful cannons, and escape before the bomber's gunners could even react. They had seen this play out before. The Royal Air Force had tried daylight bombing in 1939 and 1940, sending their Wellingtons and Handley Page Hamdens against German targets. The results were catastrophic. The British bombers were slaughtered, their lighter .303 caliber machine guns proving utterly inadequate against the cannons and armor of the German fighters. The RAF quickly retreated into the relative safety and inherent inaccuracy of night raids. Why would the Americans, these newcomers to the European war, believe they could succeed where the battle-tested British had so spectacularly failed? What Göring didn't know, what none of his finest tacticians could yet comprehend, was that they were not looking at an ordinary bomber. They were looking at the physical embodiment of an industrial and engineering philosophy entirely alien to their own. German engineering prized elegant, high-performance designs, often complex and difficult to mass-produce. It was the philosophy of a master watchmaker. American engineering, by contrast, was the philosophy of a sledgehammer. A philosophy built not on elegance or speed, but on brute force resilience, overwhelming firepower, and an almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment that should have disintegrated 3 conventional aircraft. The pilots of the Luftwaffe would soon learn this truth in the hardest way imaginable. They would meticulously plan their attacks, execute them with textbook precision, see their cannon shells tear grapefruit-sized holes in the wings and fuselage of a B-17, watch its engines trail thick black smoke, and see it fall away from its formation, a dead plane flying. They would log it as a confirmed kill. Then, hours later, reports would filter back from listening posts. Reports that would be dismissed at first as Allied propaganda, then as clerical errors, and finally, with a growing sense of dread, as an impossible, terrifying reality. The same ghost they had killed had somehow limped across the English Channel and landed safely, sometimes with half a wing gone. The laughter in the Luftwaffe High Command would soon die, replaced by a silent, gnawing dread as they realized they weren't fighting an airplane, they were fighting a monster. The concept of the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was born from a radical, almost heretical belief within the pre-war U.S. Army Air Corps, that a bomber could be made so tough and so heavily armed that it could forge its own path into the heart of enemy territory. This doctrine of the self-defending bomber was America's answer to a strategic problem. They lacked fighter aircraft with the range to escort bombers all the way to targets deep within Germany and back.
The solution, they argued, was to make the bomber its own escort. The keys to this audacious strategy were two revolutionary pieces of technology. The first was the bomber itself, the B-17. The second was the legendary Norden bomb sight, a top-secret mechanical computer of astonishing complexity. It was so highly classified that bombardiers were trained to destroy it with a thermite charge rather than let it be captured. The Norden, it was claimed, could allow a bombardier to, quote, drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, unquote. This promise of surgical precision was the moral and strategic justification for daylight bombing. America would not level cities. It would destroy the factories, rail yards, and power plants that fueled the Nazi war machine.
On August 17, 1942, this theory was put to its first tentative test. 12 B-17s of the 97th Bomb Group flew from England to attack the rail yards at Rouen, France. The elite Focke-Wulf pilots of Jagdgeschwader II, led by aces like Egon Meyer, rose to intercept, expecting an easy slaughter. Instead, they were met by a storm of .50 caliber fire that shocked them. The American gunners were disciplined, firing in coordinated bursts, and their heavy bullets had a longer effective range than the Germans anticipated. Lieutenant Erich Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II reported after the mission, "Clouds of tracers came from every direction. It was not like shooting at a bomber. It was like attacking a porcupine of fire. We could not get close without flying through a storm of metal." Most astonishingly, all 12 B-17s returned to base. One aircraft, later nicknamed Butcher Shop, came back with 132 bullet and cannon holes, yet not one crewman was seriously injured. The Luftwaffe had failed to draw blood. The mission was a small proof of concept, but it was just a pinprick. The true test would come with deeper, deadlier missions into the heart of the Reich, where the full fury of the Luftwaffe would be unleashed. It was in those crucibles of fire and steel that the legends would be forged, where German pilots would empty their entire ammunition loads into a single bomber, watch it burn and spiral away, only to discover later that they had witnessed not a death, but a miracle. The true story of the B-17 was not written in its specifications, but in the unbelievable stories of the ones that came back. The abstract theory of the B-17's durability, witnessed in the bullet-riddled but intact survivors of early raids, was one thing. To truly comprehend the machine's soul, however, required a story so extreme, so contrary to the laws of physics and warfare, that it would transcend from a combat report into a legend. That story was forged in the cold, clear skies over North Africa, and its protagonist was a B-17F from the 414th Bombardment Squadron, bearing the impossibly optimistic name All-American. On February 1, 1943, All-American was part of a formation returning from a perilous mission to bomb the German-held port of Tunis. The raid had been successful, but the price was high. As they withdrew, the B-17s were swarmed by the agile, deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109s of Jagdgeschwader 53. The sky became a chaotic maelstrom of arcing tracers, black puffs of flak, and the roar of nearly 200 engines pushed to their limits. In the desperate, swirling dogfight, one of the leading B-17s took severe damage. Its controls shot away. It began a slow, agonizing descent out of the formation. Below it, the crew of All-American, piloted by First Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, watched with grim understanding. A lone bomber was a dead bomber. Two Bf-109s, seeing a wounded straggler, peeled off to finish the job. They dove in, cannons blazing. What happened next was a freak accident of timing and velocity. The lead German pilot, focused intently on his target, misjudged his attack run.
The falling B-17 suddenly lurched, and to avoid a collision, the German pilot yanked his fighter into a sharp climb. The second German pilot, following closely behind, had no time to react. Instead of shooting his target, he slammed his Bf-109 directly into the rear fuselage of All-American. The impact was apocalyptic. The Messerschmitt, laden with fuel and ammunition, exploded in a blossoming fireball, instantly vaporizing. But not before its hardened right wing, traveling at over 300 miles per hour, acted as a giant cleaver. It sliced clean through the B-17's aluminum skin, structure, and control systems. The entire left horizontal stabilizer and its corresponding elevator were sheared off and sent tumbling into space. The right stabilizer was mangled, its control surfaces shredded. The top of the vertical fin and the rudder were torn away, leaving a ragged stump. The fuselage itself was ripped open, creating a gaping, terrifying hole large enough to drive a car through.
Inside the aircraft, the violence of the impact was catastrophic. In the tail, Sergeant Sam Sarpoulos was thrown from his gun position like a rag doll. His twin .50 cals twisted into scrap metal. The vital control cables leading to the tail were severed. Hydraulic lines ruptured, spraying flammable fluid. The oxygen system depressurized instantly. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Bragg felt the control yoke kicked violently from his hands as the plane shuddered, rolled onto its side, and began to spiral uncontrollably towards the Mediterranean Sea. By every known law of aerodynamics and combat, All-American was dead. Any German pilot witnessing the collision would have, with absolute certainty, radioed in a confirmed kill and turned for home. There was no surviving such damage. A plane without a tail is not a plane. It is a falling brick. But nobody had told Lieutenant Bragg or his airplane that. As they plummeted from 24,000 feet, the 10 men inside fought back against gravity and death. The co-pilot, Lieutenant G.P. Gip Gibson, grabbed his own yoke, and together with Bragg, they hauled back with all their combined strength. The plane was in a violent left-turning dive, dragged down by the weight of its intact left wing and the immense drag from the mangled fuselage. Thinking fast, Bragg performed an act of inspired airmanship. He shoved the throttles for the two engines on the right wing to full power, while pulling the two on the left back to near idle. This asymmetrical thrust began to counteract the death spiral. Miraculously, at a hard-stopping 10,000 feet, they managed to wrestle the aircraft into a semblance of level flight. They were alive, but they were still hundreds of miles from their base in Biskra, Algeria, flying a crippled monster over hostile territory. The mangled tail section was flapping wildly in the slipstream, held on by what seemed like sheer willpower. Every gust of wind threatened to tear the rest of the fuselage apart. To maintain their fragile balance, the uninjured crew members were ordered forward. They scrambled over the catwalk of the bomb bay, their movements careful and deliberate, gathering in the radio room and nose compartment. They even took their heavy flak jackets and spare parachutes, piling them in the far nose to add more weight and keep the tail from dropping. For nearly 2 agonizing hours, they nursed the dying machine homeward. They were completely alone. Their radio was destroyed, and they were flying too low and erratically to be seen by other friendly aircraft. As they finally approached the distant silhouette of their home airfield, the control tower operators saw the impossible mangled shape approaching and sounded the alarm, assuming it was a damaged enemy plane attempting a suicide run, or worse, a new type of flying bomb. All other aircraft were ordered to stay clear. Lieutenant Bragg now faced the final terrifying challenge, landing a plane that was barely flying. Without a functioning rudder or elevators, he could only control his pitch and yaw with the throttles, a feat of incredible skill. As he lowered the landing gear, he knew the final impact with the runway could be the last straw for the weakened tail. He brought the plane in faster than normal, skimming the runway, holding it off until the last possible second. He touched down on the main wheels with impossible gentleness, letting the aircraft roll for as long as possible before the tail skid finally made contact. The tail held. All American was home. The ground crews who rushed to the plane in their jeeps and ambulances stopped dead in their tracks. They walked around the aircraft in stunned, reverent silence. The rear fuselage was held together by just a few inches of metal skin on the bottom and two thin structural longerons. They could literally see clear through the airplane. When photographs of the damage reached the Boeing company in Seattle, their top engineers ran the calculations. Their official conclusion was simple and chilling. According to every formula they knew, the aircraft should not have been able to fly. Yet it had. The story of All American became the stuff of legend. It spread like wildfire through every bomb group in the 8th Air Force, a tale told and retold in briefing rooms and Nissen huts across England. It was tangible proof that their B-17s were something more than just machines. For German intelligence, however, it was a baffling puzzle. They had a confirmed pilot report of a mid-air collision and the certain destruction of a B-17 over Tunis. Yet, that plane never appeared on the American loss lists for that day. It was the first of many ghosts that would come to haunt the Luftwaffe, a mechanical specter that proved the Fette Hennes were far, far harder to kill than they had ever imagined.
The incredible survival of All American was not a fluke. It was a dramatic symptom of a much larger strategic reality. That reality was not forged in the crucible of combat, but in the sprawling, thunderous factories of the American heartland. The B-17's resilience was a direct product of a design philosophy backed by an industrial power so vast, so prodigal, and so relentless that it operated on a scale the German high command could not, and would not, believe was possible. While German engineers at Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf were masters of their craft, creating high-performance fighters that were marvels of aeronautical engineering, they operated within a system that valued quality over quantity. Each fighter was a finely tuned instrument of war, produced with a craftsman's attention to detail. The American approach was fundamentally different. The engineers at Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed designed the B-17 not as a rapier, but as a sledgehammer. It was built for two things above all else: durability and mass production. Every critical component in the B-17 was deliberately over-engineered and built with layers of redundancy. The main wing spar, the structural backbone of the wing, was so massively strong that engineers joked it could support the weight of a freight train. This meant a wing could absorb catastrophic damage, losing entire sections of its skin and internal ribbing, and still not collapse. The control cables for the rudder and elevators were duplicated, running down opposite sides of the fuselage. If one side was severed by flak or cannon fire, the other could still provide the pilot with a degree of control. The fuel tanks were not simple aluminum containers. They were lined with multiple layers of rubber. When a bullet or piece of shrapnel punctured a tank, the gasoline would cause the inner rubber lining to swell, automatically sealing the hole and preventing a catastrophic leak or fire. The crew, the most precious cargo, were shielded by heavy steel armor plates strategically placed around their positions, capable of stopping a 20mm cannon shell. This philosophy of brute force engineering was then fed into the maw of American industry. The results defied European comprehension. At Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, a facility so vast it had its own weather patterns, production lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At its peak, that single factory, along with licensed production lines at Douglas in Long Beach and Lockheed Vega in Burbank, was completing 16 B-17s every single day, one every 90 minutes. Over the course of the war, more than 12,700 flying fortresses were built.
Germany, for all its vaunted efficiency, simply could not compete. For every advanced Focke-Wulf 190 that rolled off their assembly lines, America produced 3, 4, or even 5 B-17 heavy bombers. And for every experienced pilot the Luftwaffe lost, men who had honed their skills for years over multiple fronts, America was graduating 10 new ones from a colossal training program that turned boys from farms in Iowa and cities in Ohio into competent pilots, navigators, and gunners in a matter of months. This fundamentally changed the mathematics of the air war. Without realizing it, the Luftwaffe had been drawn into a grinding, brutal war of attrition it could never hope to win. The German pilots were brilliant flyers, often possessing far more combat experience and tactical skill than their American counterparts, but they were facing an opponent that was, for all practical purposes, immortal. They were fighting not an army, but a self-regenerating organism. Major Günther Röhl, one of Germany's top aces with 275 confirmed victories, articulated the crushing despair of this reality after the war. To shoot down a B-17 was very, very difficult work. You had to get close through their terrible defensive fire. You could put your whole cannon ammunition into one, see an engine on fire, see pieces flying off it, and it still flew. But the real problem was not the airplane. The problem was that if you did shoot one down, tomorrow there were 2 more in its place. We were running out of pilots and planes. They never seemed to run out of either. This brutal arithmetic came to a head in the autumn of 1943. The American 8th Air Force, determined to prove its daylight bombing doctrine, launched a series of deep penetration raids against critical German industrial targets. The most infamous of these were the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August and a second, even more devastating raid on the Schweinfurt ball bearing plants in October. That mission, on October 14, 1943, would forever be known to the bomber crews as Black Thursday. Lacking fighter escort for the majority of the mission, a force of 291 B-17s flew into a perfectly executed ambush by over 300 German fighters. The sky over Germany became a charnel house. For hours, the Luftwaffe pilots attacked in relentless waves, using new tactics like head-on passes and air-to-air rockets. The American gunners fought back with desperate courage, filling the air with a web of .50 caliber tracers, but the German fighters pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. From the German perspective, it was a staggering victory. They shot down 60 B-17s, a full 20% of the attacking force. Another 17 were so badly damaged they crash-landed or were scrapped upon returning to England. The Luftwaffe had, it seemed, decisively proven Hermann Göring's point. The unescorted daylight bomber could not survive over the Reich. But they were celebrating the wrong statistics. While 60 bombers were lost, over 200 returned. More than 2,000 American airmen came back alive to fly again. And most importantly, within a single month, every single one of the lost 60 B-17s had been replaced with a brand new one, fresh from the production lines in California and Washington. The 8th Air Force was back at full strength. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had lost 38 fighters and, crucially, 25 of its experienced pilots in the battle, aces and flight leaders who represented thousands of hours of irreplaceable combat experience. America was trading steel for the lives of German experts, and they had an infinite supply of steel. The B-17s that limped back from these hellish missions were often in an appalling state, flying testaments to the brutality of the fight and the miracle of their engineering. There was Olde Pub, which returned with its entire nose section obliterated by a rocket. There was Wee Willie, which made it to base despite a fire burning through its entire rear section. These were not just damaged planes, they were flying symbols of American industrial might, each one a psychological blow to the German belief that they could win the air war. Every time a German pilot watched a B-17 absorb what should have been a death blow and continue to fly on, a seed of doubt was planted. It was the doubt that perhaps, just perhaps, they were fighting a war that could not be won.
The legend of the B-17 was not merely written in twisted metal and improbable aerodynamics, but it was also etched into the human conscience of the men who flew against it. While statistics and production numbers can explain the strategic outcome of the air war, they cannot capture the profound psychological impact the Flying Fortress had on individual German pilots. No story illustrates this more powerfully than the incredible, almost unbelievable encounter between an American rookie pilot named Charlie Brown and a German ace named Franz Stigler, an encounter where the B-17's sheer will to survive transcended the very nature of combat. On December 20, 1943, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old from West Virginia, was piloting his B-17F, Olde Pub, on his very first combat mission. The target was a Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, a heavily defended industrial heartland of the Third Reich. For Brown and his crew, the baptism by fire was immediate and brutal. As they approached the target, the sky erupted in the infamous German Flak, a terrifying barrage of black puffs of smoke that concealed jagged shards of flying steel. Olde Pub was hit repeatedly. The plexiglass nose cone shattered, sending a blast of Arctic air at -60 degrees Celsius through the plane. The No. 2 engine was hit and died, and the No. 4 engine was severely damaged, its power output cut by more than half. Limping and struggling to keep up, Olde Pub began to fall behind the protective formation on the long flight home, a straggler. Alone, crippled and flying slowly, it was a wounded animal separated from the herd, a perfect target for the wolves. And the wolves came. A swarm of over a dozen Bf-109s and Fw-190s from Jagdgeschwader 11 descended upon them with merciless efficiency. For 10 minutes that felt like an eternity, the German fighters attacked in relentless waves. The result was a systematic, clinical destruction. The tail gunner was killed instantly in the first pass. The left waist gunner was gravely wounded, his leg nearly severed. The radio operator was hit in the head. Shrapnel tore through the cockpit, wounding Brown's right foot. One by one, the B-17's defensive machine guns were knocked out or froze solid in the frigid blast of air. The oxygen system was destroyed. The hydraulics were shot out, leaving the landing gear to dangle precariously. The electrical systems failed. The radio was silent. Riddled with hundreds of bullet holes, its control surfaces shredded, Olde Pub was mortally wounded. It finally lurched into an uncontrolled, violent spiral towards the frozen German landscape below. In the cockpit, deprived of oxygen and fighting the G-forces, Charlie Brown lost consciousness.
That is when Franz Stigler found him. Oberleutnant Stigler was the antithesis of the rookie Charlie Brown. He was a seasoned veteran, an ace with 27 confirmed victories. He had fought in North Africa, in Sicily, and over the skies of Germany. He had seen everything the war had to offer. On this day, he had just returned to his base, refueled and rearmed his Bf-109, and was taking off again when he saw the lone, spiraling B-17. This was a gift. One more victory and he would have 28, qualifying him for the Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest and most coveted military honor. It was the dream of every German pilot. He climbed swiftly, positioning himself behind and above the falling bomber. the classic attack position. He pushed the stick forward, diving to finish the kill. He centered the helpless B-17 in his gun sight, his thumb resting on the firing button. But then, something made him hesitate. The bomber wasn't just damaged. It was a flying wreck, a ghost of an airplane. He flew closer, his professional curiosity overriding his killer instinct. What he saw shocked him to his core. The plane's tail and rear fuselage were shredded, revealing the dead tail gunner slumped in his bloody cockpit. Through the gaping holes in the waist, he could see crewmen, themselves wounded, desperately trying to aid their comrades. And in the shattered cockpit, he could see the pilot, a young man no older than his own younger brother, fighting with the controls, his face pale with terror and hypoxia. A memory flashed through Stigler's mind. The words of his former commanding officer, a man he revered from the deserts of North Africa. "You are fighter pilots, not murderers. We follow the rules of war. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself." Stigler looked at the ruined bomber, barely flying, its guns silent, its crewmen decimated. To him, shooting this plane down now would be the same as shooting a man in a parachute. There was no honor in it. It would be murder. In that moment, Franz Stigler made a decision that defied orders, that defied the logic of war, a decision that could have seen him court-martialed and executed by the Gestapo. He took his thumb off the trigger. He knew the crippled bomber would never make it back to England on its own. Its compass was destroyed, and it was flying deeper into German territory. So Stigler did the unthinkable. He flew his Bf-109 alongside the B-17's left wing, just off the cockpit. The terrified American crewmen stared at him, convinced this was a cruel game before the final fatal attack. But Stigler made eye contact with the shocked Charlie Brown and gestured, pointing down towards the ground, trying to convince him to land his plane at a German airfield, where his wounded crew would get medical attention. Brown, confused and disoriented, simply shook his head and flew on.
Realizing the American pilot was determined to try for home, Stigler made another incredible choice. He decided to become the B-17's escort. He repositioned his fighter, flying in a loose formation off the bomber's wing. He knew that as they flew over German territory, they would pass over flak batteries. The gunners on the ground, seeing a German fighter flying in perfect formation with an American bomber, would assume the bomber had been captured and was being escorted to a German base. They would hold their fire. And they did. For hundreds of miles, the German ace shielded the American bomber from its own defenses. Stigler stayed with Ye Olde Pub until they reached the cold, gray expanse of the North Sea. He was sure now that they were out of German airspace. He flew up one last time, locked eyes with Charlie Brown, rendered a crisp military salute, and peeled his B-109 away, back towards Germany, knowing he had willingly thrown away his Knight's Cross for an act of honor. Against all conceivable odds, Charlie Brown flew the mangled wreck of his plane 250 miles across the treacherous North Sea and made a successful crash landing at the first airfield he saw in England, RAF Seething. Upon landing, the aircraft was so structurally compromised that it threatened to break in two on the runway. The intelligence officers who debriefed the crew were stunned by the story of the chivalrous German pilot. They classified the report, ordering Brown and his crew to never speak of it. An honorable enemy did not fit the wartime propaganda narrative. The story remained a secret for over 40 years, but it stands as the ultimate testament to the B-17's legend. It was an aircraft so tough, so resilient, so fundamentally unwilling to die, that it could inspire an enemy ace in the heat of combat and on the cusp of his greatest glory to abandon his mission and choose humanity instead. It was a plane that didn't just bend the laws of physics, it bent the rules of war itself. By the spring of 1944, the character of the air war over Europe began a seismic shift. The arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang, a fighter with the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, spelled the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. No longer could German aces wait for the bombers to be alone and vulnerable. Now they had to fight their way through swarms of what they grimly nicknamed Jagdschutz, or fighter protection, just to get a shot at the B-17s. The hunter had become the hunted. Yet this development did not diminish the B-17's crucial role. It vindicated it. For over a year, the Flying Fortress had been the instrument of a brutal, grinding strategy. It had served as the anvil upon which the Luftwaffe was systematically broken. The B-17s were the bait, the irresistible target that forced the German fighter force to come up and fight day after day, week after week. They flew into the heart of the Reich and dared the Luftwaffe to stop them. The Germans, in their valiant and ultimately futile defense of their homeland, accepted the challenge. In doing so, they flew into the teeth of the combat box and into a war of attrition against an enemy with a bottomless well of resources. The B-17 absorbed the blows, bled, but never broke, buying precious time until the long-range escorts could arrive to deliver the killing blow. The German pilots who survived this crucible developed a deep, fearful respect for the B-17s and the men who flew them. Their initial mockery of the Fette Henne had long since curdled into a grim acknowledgment of its deadly effectiveness. General Adolf Galland, the charismatic and brilliant commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, was unequivocal in his post-war assessment. The B-17 was a magnificent machine, he stated, an incredible combination of firepower, range, and an almost unbelievable durability. The American crews, they were some of the bravest men I have ever seen. To fly into Germany in daylight, in those tight formations, knowing what awaited you, required a kind of courage that is hard to imagine. This respect was born from countless bitter experiences. German pilots would execute perfect head-on attacks, their preferred tactic, watching their 20mm and 30mm cannon shells explode across the cockpit and wings of a B-17, only to see the bomber shudder, absorb the hits, and continue flying as if guided by an unseen hand, its dozen other machine guns still blazing away. They learned that to kill a fortress, you couldn't just damage it, you had to obliterate it. You had to concentrate the fire of multiple fighters onto a single bomber, a tactic that left the other German fighters vulnerable to the formation's interlocking defensive fire. It was an unwinnable equation.
When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, thousands of battle-scarred B-17s were parked in vast, silent fields, boneyards, across England and the United States. Many bore the incredible wounds of their service. There were planes with mismatched wings, grafted on from salvaged aircraft. There were fuselages covered in hundreds of metal patches, each one marking a near-fatal encounter with flak or a fighter. There were engines that had been replaced 3, 4, or even 5 times. Each aircraft was a silent monument, not just to the 10 men who had formed its crew, but to the thousands of factory workers who built it, the ground crews who kept it flying against all odds, and the sheer indomitable will of the nation that had produced it. The legacy of the B-17, therefore, is not found simply in the statistics of bomb tonnage or production numbers. It is found in the fundamental philosophy it represented. It was the physical embodiment of the American doctrine of overwhelming industrial power and rugged, over-engineered design. Where German engineering created sharp, precise, and often delicate rapiers, American engineering built sledgehammers. The sledgehammer might not be as elegant or as nimble, but it was designed to absorb incredible punishment and to deliver a blow so devastating that it didn't just defeat its target, it annihilated it. This contrast was not lost on the Germans themselves. In a post-war interrogation, a high-ranking Luftwaffe intelligence officer, a man who had spent years analyzing Allied aircraft, provided what is perhaps the most insightful summary of why the B-17 was so profoundly underestimated and ultimately so successful. "We made a fundamental error in our analysis," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "We analyzed the B-17 as an airplane. We calculated its speed, its maximum altitude, its structural weak points. We were meticulous, but we were wrong. We should have analyzed it as a weapons system, and that system did not stop at the 13 machine guns and the 10-man crew. That system included the factory in Seattle, the pilot training schools in Texas and Arizona, the endless convoys of ships bringing high-octane fuel, and the unshakable American belief that you could always build more than we could ever destroy." He leaned forward, his eyes fixing on his interrogator. "Every time our pilots came back, exhausted and sometimes wounded, and swore on their honor that they had shot down a B-17, that they had seen it explode, seen a wing come off, and then that specific aircraft failed to appear on your official loss lists, it did more damage to our morale than losing 10 of our own fighters. You see, you were not just defeating us in the air, you were making us doubt reality itself. We were fighting ghosts." This psychological warfare was unintentional but devastatingly effective. The B-17 became more than an airplane. It became a symbol of an inexhaustible, almost alien power. It represented a new kind of warfare, where battles were won not just by tactics and courage, but by the relentless, grinding logic of the assembly line. The Flying Fortress had taken the Luftwaffe's best punch day after day and had simply refused to fall down. And in doing so, it had broken not just the back of the German Air Force, but its spirit.
When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the true scale of the B-17's contribution could be measured. Flying Fortress units flew more than 291,000 sorties and dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on Nazi-occupied Europe, more than any other American aircraft. But its most important and often overlooked statistic was its loss rate. Despite being the primary target of the Luftwaffe for years, the B-17 had the lowest loss rate per sortie of any American bomber in the European theater. Its reputation for bringing its crews home was not just a myth, it was a statistical fact, paid for in sweat, rivets, and the lives of the brave men who flew them. The final verdict on the aircraft came from the men who knew it best, not just those who flew in it, but those who flew against it. In the quiet years after the war, at reunions where former adversaries met as friends, the stories were told again. German aces, men like Johannes Steinhoff and Günter Rall, spoke of the B-17 with a mixture of professional admiration and a lingering sense of awe. They talked about the discipline of the American formations, the courage of the crews, and above all, the sheer stubborn toughness of the machine itself. They no longer spoke of the Fette Henne, but of the Viermotorige Zerstorer, the four-engine destroyer. The B-17's design philosophy, brute force engineering backed by unlimited resources, became a cornerstone of American military and industrial thinking for the next half-century. Every component was overbuilt, overpowered, and over-engineered. The wing spars could support 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. The engine mounts could withstand incredible G-forces. The control systems had multiple layers of redundancy. The ammunition feed system was a marvel of engineering, with electric motors to prevent jamming during violent maneuvers. It was a machine built with the pessimistic assumption that everything that could go wrong in combat would go wrong, and it was designed to survive anyway.
Even after the war, some German veterans maintained that their fighters, like the swept-wing Me-262 jet, were technically superior. They argued that the B-17 won through sheer numbers, not quality. But the combat records tell a different, more nuanced story. The B-17's heavy .50 caliber machine guns, initially dismissed by the Germans as inferior to their explosive cannons, proved more effective in the reality of high-altitude combat. Analysis of gun camera footage revealed why. While a single cannon shell could be devastating, it required a precise hit from a limited ammunition supply. The B-17's 13 guns created what gunnery experts called a gun cloud of bullets. It didn't require perfect aim. It just required filling a space in the sky with so much lead that any fighter flying through it was guaranteed to be hit, often by dozens of rounds at once.
The ammunition itself was a product of superior industrial chemistry. American .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds were designed with a delayed action fuse, ensuring they would penetrate the enemy fighter's thin aluminum skin before detonating inside, igniting fuel lines and hydraulic fluid. German cannon shells often exploded on contact, creating spectacular but sometimes superficial damage that a B-17 could absorb. The Flying Fortress remains the third most produced bomber of all time, a testament to its effectiveness. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by young men barely out of high school, and maintained under the most grueling combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in a matter of weeks. It was the ultimate expression of democratic warfare, a people's weapon built by the people for a mission to save the people. The transformation of German opinion, from arrogant mockery in 1942 to fearful respect by 1945, was complete. Veterans who had faced British Spitfires and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of the B-17 in hushed, reverent tones for decades after the war. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored B-17D sits in silent tribute. Its placard lists specifications and battle honors, but the real story is told by a simple quote from an unnamed German pilot taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them," the pilot confessed. "Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades." The B-17 Flying Fortress entered combat as an object of derision and ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In the 2 years in between, its synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of steel and lead. The German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American bomber in 1942. By May 1945, there were very few experienced German pilots left to laugh. The thunder of the fortress had spoken, and the sky over Europe belonged to the Allies. In the end, America's greatest victory was not just on the battlefield, but in the prison camps, where the overwhelming evidence of democratic prosperity accomplished what armies could not: the complete transformation of enemy minds. The B-17 was the vanguard of that evidence, a flying testament to a simple, overwhelming truth. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was not just its military might, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's capacity to create, endure, and ultimately to triumph.